Today we're talking about landscape architecture. Um, a little bit about me. I um, I attended Cal Poly State University in San Luis Obispo, California. Majored in landscape architecture, obviously, but ironically enough, I started off as a construction management major and kind of stumbled through the first year through that program. I thought that's what I wanted. Fortunately, I was introduced to landscape architecture and changed after I spent a year in the construction management program. And I think a big part of why that happened to me was I simply didn't have a program like ACE to help kind of guide me towards those decisions. I had a little bit of a construction background, had been doing that, so construction management seemed like a logical fit for me. But once I was in there and was exposed to different professions, it changed my mind. So hopefully ACE can kind of save you the trouble of spending a first year as a construction management major. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but hopefully it gets you on your path a little bit quicker than it did for me. So in order to become a landscape architect, typically you do attend college for either a 4-year bachelor program, or now there are 5 years, what they call Bachelor of Landscape programs, which essentially takes you through the same 4-year curriculum, but also offers a 5th year, essentially a concentration or a focus, and that could be anywhere from recreational design to urban planning. It just depends on the program, but you can kind of specialize in a program or a field after that, after those 4 years. And then once you get out of school, like most of the professionals that are mentoring, there are licensure and exam to become, whether it's a PE or a registered architect, or in my case, a professional landscape architect. And that typically consists of a national exam, several sections. I think there's 5 sections now. One or two is multiple choice and goes over a variety of topics related to the profession. And then we actually have what they call design charrettes and grading and drainage charrettes, where they give you essentially design problems to solve in a very short amount of time, and those are evaluated by professionals across the country, and that's how they determine if you pass or not. So there are some states, California being an example, that have additional exams that you must pass for particular environments, like in the case of California, learning about seismic activity and make sure your designs can hold up for that. So you know what, when you go through school and you start getting into the profession, you start developing a toolbox of things that make you a landscape architect. And a lot of these, or some of these, are soil science, trying to determine what soils are like. Obviously, we deal with plant material, live material, so we want to make sure soils can support those. Plant material, obviously, you're again dealing with, that's kind of one of our primary building materials as a landscape architect, is plant material. So depending on where you live and practice, you need to know pretty specific plants, what do well and what are generally acceptable in those areas. Grading and drainage, we deal a lot with landform. In conjunction with civil engineers, we try to find that balance between utilitarian design and also the aesthetic. So, but grading and drainage is a big part. Irrigation design, we get into structures, botany for a closer look at plant material. And the big one is always safety, health, and welfare, which kind of bridges most of the, if not all of the disciplines. And once you get out to the real world and start practicing landscape architecture, it could take you on a variety of paths and opportunities, different types of projects to work on. I spent a majority of my career working on park and recreation type projects, regional parks, neighborhood parks, trails, sport complex, things like that. But I've also done transportation planning, roadway design, master plan communities. So really, there's just a lot of avenues that you can pursue once you finish school, and you can kind of find what your niche is, or if you're lucky enough, you can explore several of those avenues and focus on something that really is near and dear to your heart. To sum up, I guess, to try to give a definition of what landscape architects do, is we essentially focus on designing and the creation of space outside of the building footprint. We let our architectural friends take care of the building, and then we get left the outside to try to make connections and create spaces. And we do that through utilizing a lot of different materials and techniques. Plant material, obviously a big one for us. That's, kind of, I think most people's perception of what landscape architects do is they just plant stuff, which isn't necessarily true. We do a lot more than that, but plant material is a big part of that. We use trees, shrubs, ground covers, but we use them very specifically and for specific reasons, like providing shade or wind barriers or wildlife corridors and habitat. So it's a lot more than just putting a tree in the ground and calling it good. There's always a reason for that, and I guess kind of a method to our madness when it comes to plant material, which is why, depending on where you practice, you need to know what plant material is appropriate for the area and appropriate for what you're trying to achieve. Water is a big one. I did a lot of work in Arizona for a while, and water was big for a variety of reasons, mainly for cooling, but also water play and recreation also come into play. But water can also offer calming and white noise and just kind of create more of an atmosphere. So definitely a lot of uses for water in landscape architecture and design. And of course, we get into what we all consider more traditional building materials. Wood obviously is a good choice for a lot of applications, whether it's dimensional lumber or rough timber. We use those products for anything from decks and fencing, getting into structures like arbors and gazebos for shade. Trees also get chewed up and made into mulch, which you see in a lot of planting beds. Wood mulch or rock mulch prevents water evaporation in the soil and kind of maintains the temperature in the soil to help the plants grow. So wood gets used a lot for a variety of reasons. And then we get into essentially hardscape type materials, concrete, masonry units, and even rough stone. And each of these, like plant material, has a right time and place to use that. And a lot of that depends on what you're trying to achieve, what your setting is. A lot of times we work with the architects to play off of some kind of aesthetic framework that they've established. So in the upper left photo, we have a very contemporary design architecture, raw concrete. So that was the response there, which is kind of appropriate. But then we also see pictures of very rough stone, textured concrete, colored concrete, again, all just trying to achieve the effect that you want for your project. And then landform, which I think is one of the biggest components of landscape architecture, regardless of scale, actually. But we do shape the land to try to achieve the effects that we want, and we can do that through mounds, depressions, or valleys, hills, terracing, and like I mentioned, we do work with civil engineers quite a bit to get the grading and drainage that is required to drain the site, but also, try to do it in an aesthetic way. So it's not, it's a little bit of a softer approach. And I've been fortunate to work with a lot of civil engineers who really get that landform aesthetic that we're looking for, and they really do can be a valuable part of the design team. But landform also helps with soil stabilization. It can also provide visual and noise barriers. I've done a lot of freeway work where we do a lot of earth mounding just to protect neighborhoods from sounds of cars driving by at high speed. So it's a very effective way to mitigate noise pollution. And that kind of goes hand in hand with that last item there, balance cut and fill, which means when you're developing a site and you're excavating for your house or our rec center, you're going to have dirt left over, especially if there's a basement in that facility. So instead of spending the money to export that dirt off site, you simply try to find an aesthetic way to spread it back onto the site and not only create an amenity, but you also are more efficient, more cost effective in your project. So earthwork is kind of can be a very big deal in bigger projects and something that requires a lot of attention. And really, we do use all these materials and these techniques to ultimately create spaces, because that's what landscape architects do. And this next series of slides was kind of intended just to show not only how landscape architects can be effective in creating these spaces, but also the types of spaces that you can, or the types of projects that you can be involved in as a landscape architect. I think a lot of people do have a misconception on what we can actually do, and some of the projects that we've probably have been the prime consultant on, but you may not realize what we actually do. So, trying to bring nature into our communities. I'm sure we've all seen planned communities popping up all around Colorado, and each one of them has a very distinct aesthetic to it. A lot of that is marketing and saleability of housing, but also we want to introduce landscape back into those communities for environmental reasons, like trying to mitigate heat island effect by introducing shade. Plant material is very effective at filtering rainwater, filtering pollutants out of the air. So it's kind of silently doing its job, and you may or may not know that. Landscape and the workplace is becoming a huge deal, especially in corporate campuses and office campuses where these owners, like Facebook, will invest a significant amount of money in the outdoor space for their employees for a variety of reasons, just to give them the amenities, because they may be there. Nobody wants to feel like they're at work for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. So they want to provide places for meeting their friends or just simply relaxing. And they find that by investing in these campuses, their employees are generally happier because they're happier with their surroundings. They feel comfortable. It's pleasing to the eye and the ears. So a lot of money goes into developing these campuses for the benefit of employees. And that kind of goes hand in hand with campus design and educational design for students who are like employees. They're at a place for 8 to 10 hours a day, not working but learning. But the same thing, we want to give them a environment that they feel comfortable in, that they feel secure in, that they enjoy. A lot of this is just trying to mitigate just the stress of everyday life. And if you're surrounded by a more natural setting, you tend to kind of, whether you realize it or not, kind of slide into a more calming personality, or just simply feel better about your surroundings. Healing gardens have been a big thing for a number of years, and healthcare systems have kind of finally honed into the fact that patients who can make a connection with landscape and nature as they're trying to heal can in fact heal quicker when they are surrounded by a natural setting. And there's sensory gardens and healing gardens, and they all kind of just reintroduce that landscape back into what was traditionally a very sterile environment. Healthcare has come a long way, not only in landscape architecture design, but architectural design as well, where it's not that sterile, cold place anymore, because they're finding that patients do in fact heal quicker, both mentally and physically, when they're surrounded by settings such as these. So healthcare design is pretty big deal these days. And then obviously play. Landscape architects are constantly involved in a variety of recreational facilities, playgrounds and water parks and skate parks and trails, whether those are urban trails or very natural trails out in the mountains. Those trails are specifically placed based on landform and slope, and trying to mitigate tearing up existing landscapes. So, but play facilities are kind of a bread and butter of landscape architects. It's kind of a natural, I think kind of a natural association. Obviously outdoor facilities and very defined, very designed spaces. So Park and Recs is kind of a big, kind of a natural combination for us. And then even into shopping and entertainment districts. Landscape architects play a huge role in developing an aesthetic for these places and spaces. And we do that, or asked to do that, primarily because retail owners want to keep their customers there at their stores as long as they can, enjoy the day. If you feel like you're in a park-like setting or even a resort setting for some of these, you mentally feel like staying longer, and maybe you spend a little bit more money. I don't know that for a fact, but we play a huge role in developing an aesthetic for these shopping districts, entertainment districts, just so people can come to these places, hang out longer than they probably would if it was just maybe a colder urban setting, and just try to give it a more comforting feel, so you feel like staying quite a bit longer. And then lastly, I mean, what it comes down to is landscape architects just try to develop these spaces so you can make a connection back to the natural environment. And obviously these photos are very, very natural, very rustic, but they kind of just, if I were to go back to all the other images, they kind of hint at the same thing, and that's trying to get people to make that connection back to nature. And it's even more important these days when urban infill, downtown, new buildings springing up all the time. You may lose that connection to the landscape, and we try to introduce it back, because we always feel that it's important, not only from a mental standpoint, physical standpoint, but ecological reasons as well, are all good points for trying to introduce that back into the environment. So pretty quick overview of what landscape architects do. Lots of visuals. I just wanted to maybe show kind of a broad spectrum of projects that we can be involved in and typically are involved in. So again, it's not, landscape architects do a heck of a lot more than just plant trees or shrub it up, as we're often referred to as just shrubbing it up. We do a lot more. We influence a lot of the outdoor space that you're seeing. A lot of planned communities are the work of landscape architects. College campuses, you'll see a lot of our work when you go off to school. So very exciting career. I think what I like most about it is it really provides a great combination of technical skills such as grading and drainage and working with utilities. And we do build things like walls and shade structures and more hardscape elements, but then you also get to do kind of the softer design, the true aesthetic design, like a planting design. There's a lot of thought that's going into that. One of the interesting things about landscape architects that I think kind of sets us apart is that we also deal with a fourth dimension of time. And when we're done with our project, it doesn't look like what we envisioned in our mind, because we have to wait patiently for material to grow and hope that it survives winters and people walking on it and things like that. So a landscape architect requires a different kind of vision. I think we need to kind of know what the end result's going to be without being able to see it. And then we also have to be patient and know that we're essentially at the whims of Mother Nature for the success for a lot of our designs. So just an interesting kind of perspective on landscape architecture. So with that, I'm just going to open up if anyone has any questions or comments. Okay, rather than a activity, what I did was, and Joey had mentioned that, I went ahead and just posted some, they're essentially just coloring book pages, but I thought it might be fun. We're all in this even more forced digital world these days because of COVID, and maybe you lose track of just being able to sit down and draw or color and just kind of let your hand kind of exercise itself too with coloring. And I provided the coloring pages, so you don't even have to think about what you're drawing. You can simply color, but feel free to throw a piece of trace paper over these and change them, or pick color schemes, or maybe come up with an idea that isn't presented on these drawings, and just kind of relax and have fun with it. Shade it, color it.
Ernest, there's some questions in the chat also for you.
Yeah, I was going to go ahead and read those for you. So okay. Ivan asked two good questions. So the first one is, how does landscaping look like during these times, since most people don't go out as often? So what's happening with landscape in that regard?
That is a good question. And I think it just depends. I mean, for the more urban settings, I think, people are still maintaining landscapes. There's still maintenance companies that are out there. It's winter, so most of the stuff is dormant right now. So it's probably not as much of a deal now, but I still think landscapes being maintained. I still see quite a few people out on trails and even in parks. I see a lot of rec leagues out there practicing soccer and things like that. So I imagine it's still holding up. I think when you see the bigger effect is when cities and towns maybe lose a little bit of their funding. Downturns in the economy mean that cities don't have as much money for maintenance or irrigation. I've seen communities shut off irrigation to their whole park systems during the summer in Arizona, and that has a devastating effect in landscape. So COVID, I think we're holding up pretty good. When there's an economic downturn, that's when you might start looking at things.
And then Ivan had a second question that is really good. Ivan, you said it might sound stupid. It's not a stupid question at all. It's a fantastic question. I'm sure Ernest will really appreciate as well, is how does landscape architecture specifically impact physical and mental health?
Oh gosh. Well, mentally, I think, you might serve yourself better by just researching some of that. But it's, some of the research I've seen is that people, landscape is something that we all, and even architecture, is something that we all relate to regardless of our backgrounds. We all live in some kind of structure. We all eventually go outside. So those are things that I think we are naturally connected to. And if you lose that connection, I do think it can have effects on your mental health. I mean, if you just consider this, if you were in a room without a window and that's where you stayed 24 hours a day, what do you think your mental attitude would be after a while, as opposed to being in that same room for 24 hours a day with a window to the outside or a window to, facing the Rocky Mountains? You're still inside for 24 hours a day, but kind of picture what your mental outlook would be in one case or the other. And then getting into things like, physically, the sunshine, natural sunlight, and the spectrum of light that comes from that does influence, mentally, but also physically, your sleep habits, your circadian rhythms. So, vitamin D you get from the sun. So the more we can make these spaces to invite people outdoors, I do think that you're going to be better off physically and mentally.
And then the only other question we had in the chat was from Jasper, and that was just asking about, do you, in your opinion, think it's better to have more benches or trees or things like that in their tiny house village, in their community?
Well, I mean, I think, given the location and the adjacent properties, and it's a hard urban setting, I think I would be more prone to doing the trees. I mean, the trees will do a heck of a lot more for your community over the long run than benches. You have to ask yourself, based on the designs that you're coming up, are you creating spaces where people will be wanting to congregate for long periods of time and everybody needs a place to sit? Or are you better off shading your site, softening the urban fabric, the visual aesthetics of the trees, a healthy, mature landscape and the impact it has on property values, resale values, worth it. So, a lot of it comes down to how your site starts to shape up. There's also things to consider, like, and a lot of communities do, a lot of municipalities do think about placement of benches, whether it's in streetscape or parks, simply from, a homeless perspective as well. Benches are great places for homeless to, try to find a place just to sit, and sometimes, good or bad, communities don't want that. So that's something else that architects, landscape architects are asked to take a look at just from a social aspect. So, but the bottom line is you have to start figuring out what kind of space you want and make that determination based on your design.
Does anyone else have any questions?
What kind of trees grow here in Colorado? Because that's another thing to take in consideration if you ever use plants or and stuff.
Oh gosh, Colorado, it's God. I wish I had one of my nursery books. I mean, there are literally just hundreds, if not thousands. Obviously evergreens are big. Spruce, obviously pine trees, oak trees, maples do well. Ornamentals like crabapple and plum trees and all that. I mean, there's just Colorado is, you do have the ability to provide just all kinds of different trees for different kinds of effects that you're trying to achieve. Evergreens for screening and providing background or seasonal color, or evergreen, year-round color. And then you have deciduous for shade, for seasonal change, colors. Maples, you get a flame maple that's turning bright red in the fall and winter. It's just spectacular. And watching the landscape change throughout the year is a pretty cool component of landscape architecture too, and the kind of that time factor, and how landscape kind of it is kind of a cycle of life kind of thing.
That was a good question. Well, if there are no other questions for Ernest, I'll take a second and say thank you, Ernest, for presenting. And it looks like Jasper had a follow-up question.
Sure.
Is it worth it to give up a few spaces for homes, like 1 or 2 homes, for a bigger area with trees?
It is, but think about what the purpose of that space is going to be. And that's always, what most of the professionals deal with, is that kind of, weighing your options and kind of weighing the pros and cons, the values of your decisions based on what you're trying to do for your design. And if it's going to help you create a space that is, community based, or you envision some kind of community activity there and you really want that space, then it could potentially be worth it to take out a few homes to do that. And as a design professional, we would have to weigh that decision against what your client ultimately wants. Your client needs a certain number of homes on the site to make it a financially viable project. So that's where you're always bouncing around ideas, and maybe there's a creative way. Maybe you could create the density of the houses in one location, keep the same number, but you free up a little bit of space to get that space you want for additional trees. So sometimes it just takes a little bit of creative thinking to see how you can maybe satisfy, because you know what the owner's going to say. The owner's going to say, no, don't take out any more tiny homes. I need to make money on this project. So that's where you step in as a professional and try to come up with those creative solutions where they get what they want, you get what you want, and the community is better for it. You can't always do that, but you can try.
Okay. Well, with that, we are going to go ahead and head into breakout rooms. The main goal for today is for you guys to work through finalizing, your building locations on your site. So make sure that you finalized where the tiny homes are going to go, where those pads are. Make sure you finalized where the community center is located, and then start thinking about how you want to incorporate landscape elements into your project, and then continue to work through the architecture. I know you guys have focused a lot on the tiny homes. Maybe start talking a little bit about the community center as well. This is the last week of a formal presentation for a while. The next 3 weeks, which depending on what school you go to, one of those 3 weeks is probably your spring break. You're obviously more than welcome to join still during spring break, but we are going to have work sessions those days. So mentors will be on the call, but we're going to be more hands off. We'll be there to answer any questions, but try to figure out and finalize some of those things today so that you are able to be successful in those work sessions over the next 3 weeks, even as people may be missing from your group. With that, we will go ahead and head into breakout rooms, and let's plan on looping back around in about an hour and at 5:45. And I would like to hear from each group one thing that they learned about landscape architecture and one thing they are incorporating into their site design. So with that, we are going to head to breakout rooms. Feel free to take about a 5-minute break, mentors, with the students. If people need to get up, go to the bathroom, do whatever. Okay, it looks like everybody is back. So hopefully everyone's an expert on landscape architecture now. We're ready to go into business with Ernest and just change all of Denver and Colorado for the better. So I can randomly I'll go through and I'll ask each group to just say, something that they incorporated or something they learned about landscape architecture this week. So we'll start with the Boulderites.
I don't know if this fully counts, but just reorganizing our space and our site plan to account for more open space and areas for trees or any other thing we want to build outdoors, like a community garden or just a meeting space. Does that count?
Yeah, I'd count that 100%.
Cool.
Okay. Was there something that you guys learned?
Yep. I learned what a pergola was.
What is a pergola, Enrique?
It has 4 legs and a roof.
What's its function?
Shade.
Shade? There you go. It would have been really nice if somebody just put a definition in your Google Slides for you, huh?
Yeah, that would be really helpful. If only I actually looked there.
Right angles.
James, you want to start that one?
So I learned about permeable pavers today. We were talking about how that the mix between the concrete and the grass, the little openings for grass allows for infiltration on the site as well. And we were talking about how that could also beautify and naturalize our parking spaces.
Awesome.
Caden?
And
Also incorporated like wooden features around the parking spaces to kind of make, I guess what would be considered a pretty bland open space have a little more character to it.
awesome. Yeah, dressing up parking spaces is not always the easiest thing, but permeable pavers and pervious paving is always good. The masters.
So we incorporated landscaping through, or I thought of Colorado Blue Columbine, and it really, because they're kind of native to Colorado, and it connects like the wildlife with like the whole tiny home. And I was also thinking with the tiny homes being a unified color, which could contrast with the blue of the color blue Columbine and make it pop out more so that you could see it like passing by.
It's a fantastic idea. Thanks, Alejandro. And No Name Colorado.
So we incorporated a berm into ours to help with drainage. And then I think we're going to do porches on our houses, but they're going to be trellis based. So you're going to be able to plant climbing plants on there to sort of give it quite a bit more character.
Thanks, Jack. And then the T-Bears.
One thing we talked about is using different varieties of trees to like just break up the monotony, but also to like make our plants more resistant to like beetles and other like diseases that the trees can get. And that was like one way we made our site like be able to last longer.
Awesome. Thank you, Ethan. Okay, did anyone else have anything that they wanted to touch on? Well, thank you everybody for joining today. Next week, I actually misspoke earlier, is going to be presentation and writing skills. So we'll do very quickly, just basically maybe run through a couple example presentations to show you guys what the format will look like as you present virtually. The final presentation is, I sent it to Andy earlier, it's Thursday, April 29th. So go ahead and mark that day down. But we will show you guys some example presentations, how you can kind of lay out what you've worked on so far, and maybe so you can see what you need to work on moving forward. But the majority of that next session will be a work session, and then the 3 weeks after that. So really the next 4 weeks are really hammering through the work and the production of things for the presentation that you guys might need. But other than that, that is all I had for today. So thank you guys for joining, and